In the sticky summer of 1847, within their Garden District mansion in New Orleans, 13 people from the well-known Bogard family died just hours apart. The official documents, hidden away in the Louisiana State Archives, give the cause as a sudden fever, but notes scribbled quickly in the margins tell a different version of events. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, who was the physician on the scene, wrote down in his personal journal that he had never seen such synchronized suffering. The signs, he noted, matched no illness he had ever encountered. The victims' nails went black, their tongues became a swollen purple, and their dying cries resonated through the halls of the mansion until morning light. Adding to the horror of this case is the fact that every single person died precisely 90 minutes after their usual Sunday evening meal. The one person in that house who lived through it was Violet, the main cook who worked in the kitchen. For 170 years, this disaster has stayed one of New Orleans' most closely held secrets, hidden away by shame, fear, and a purposeful refusal to speak of it. This evening, however, we will discover the true story of what actually occurred in that kitchen, and how a whole family line vanished over the course of a single night. Before we go on with Violet's story and the Bogard killings, be sure you have subscribed to our channel, because tales like this one are the very reason we explore America's darkest, overlooked histories. Click that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. We love making connections with fellow lovers of mysteries from everywhere in the country. The truth about that deadly Sunday meal started many years before the initial drop of poison ever touched the lips of the wealthy, rooted as it was in a pattern of cruelty that would eventually need to be paid for. New Orleans in 1847 was a place of extreme opposites, where grand homes stood like tributes to riches while the very base of that wealth was built on the backs of enslaved people. The Garden District, where Spanish moss hung over wrought iron railings like fabric for a coffin, was home to the city's richest sugar plantation owners, cotton traders, and shipping tycoons who had created their wealth through forced labor. The Bogard house was one of the most impressive in the area, a three-story Greek Revival design with tall Corinthian columns that looked like they might brush the Louisiana sky. Octave Bogard had gotten both the house and the family's large sugar farm from his father, along with a name for being what proper society referred to as very strict, and what the people he owned knew as something much more cruel. At 43, Octave controlled his home with the same hard approach he used to run his plantation. His spouse, Celeste, a fragile woman from a well-known Creole lineage, had long before chosen to ignore her husband's brutal behavior in return for keeping her spot in society. Their 4 kids, Etienne, 19, Margot, 17, Philippe, 15, and little Amélie, just 8, had been brought up to consider the enslaved people near them as possessions, no different from the expensive plates or silver utensils that decorated their eating area. The mansion held not just the main family, but also Octave's younger brother, Auguste, with his wife, Lucille, and their twin sons, Henri and Louis, both 14. Auguste managed the plantation's city business matters, while Lucille considered herself a supporter of the arts, throwing fancy parties for New Orleans' cultured society. Also part of the household was Octave's elderly mother, Grandmère Bogard, who at 78 still had significant influence over family choices, and Celeste's unmarried sister, Félicite, whose sharp tongue and even sharper eyes saw everything that went on within the house's walls. Within this setting of wealth and authority were 26 enslaved people, each carrying the unseen marks of their captivity. Yet none had scars deeper than Violet. Violet had come into the world in the mansion's slave quarters during 1823, the child of Essie, the previous head cook, who had worked herself to death when Violet was just 14. From that early age, Violet had been pushed into the position of cooking for the very family who owned her entirely. She had an almost unbelievable talent in the kitchen. Her hands seemed to instinctively know the right amount of spice, how long to let the roux darken, and what plants would turn basic items into food masterpieces that won the Bogards' admiration throughout New Orleans high society. However, Violet's gifts came with a cost that few in the house realized. She put in 18-hour days, waking before dawn to get breakfast started and finally dropping into bed after midnight when the final plate had been washed. Her cramped, windowless space in the servants' area had just a straw bed, a spare set of clothing, and a small wooden cross that had been her mother's. What made Violet's life even more difficult was her unusual spot within the household order. As lead cook, she was supposed to keep up the family's name for throwing the finest dinners in the area. Yet she was not allowed to taste the very food she made. She knew the consistency of every gravy just by sight, the doneness of each roast by aroma, and the sweetness of every dessert purely through feeling. This harsh irony was something Octave liked to point out, taking twisted satisfaction in telling her that even though she created food suited for royalty, she would eat only leftover scraps for her whole existence. The other enslaved individuals in the home regarded Violet with a combination of admiration and compassion. They admired her abilities and the minor advantages her role brought her. She was seldom beaten, never sent to labor in the cane fields, and sometimes got hand-me-down clothing from the women of the house. Still, they also felt sorry for her loneliness, because her demanding routine left hardly any room for friendships and the small moments of happiness that made their difficult lives tolerable. Among the house staff was Samuel, the son of the men who ran the stables. At 28, he had drawn Violet's interest despite the risks such feelings could bring. Their quick looks across the courtyard and whispered talks in the kitchen late at night had grown into something more serious. Even though both knew love was something enslaved people could hardly ever afford. Samuel dreamed of one day buying their freedom and beginning a life together in the Free States, but on a farm where a strong field hand might earn his owner $50 a year in profit, such hopes seemed as unreachable as the heavens. There was also old Moses, the butler who had worked for the family for more than 4 decades, his stooped back and gray hair showing the story of years spent bowing to what the Bogards wanted. Moses had gained an almost uncanny skill for foreseeing the family's wants, showing up with wine before anyone asked, and understanding exactly when to disappear during their more personal discussions. His faithfulness to the family was famous among New Orleans society, though anyone paying close attention might have caught the cold fire burning deep in his aged eyes. Young Lily, only 16, worked as a personal maid for Celeste and her daughters. Her attractiveness had not escaped the notice of the men living in the house, and she was always afraid of the attention such notice could attract. She drifted through the mansion like a spirit, trying to stay unnoticed while carrying out her tasks with the flawless quality demanded of her. In the stables worked Thomas, Samuel's father, whose knowledge of horses was equaled only by his understanding of how to endure in a world meant to crush him. Thomas had lived through 3 masters and buried 2 wives, learning a long time ago that the secret to survival was never revealing your true thoughts on your face. The daily pattern of the mansion stuck to an exact timetable that had been set over many years. Breakfast came at 7 sharp with the family gathering in the morning room that looked over the garden. Lunch happened at 1 o'clock, often with guests from New Orleans society coming by to talk about work or social matters. Yet it was the Sunday dinner that represented the highlight of the week's eating. Every Sunday night at 6, the whole extended family would come together in the big dining room under the crystal light fixture that had been brought from Paris at huge cost. The table, which could hold 20, would be laid with the best dishes, silverware, and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars. These Sunday meals were deeply important to the Bogards, a moment when work was put aside and family connections were honored and made stronger. For Violet, Sunday dinners were the high point of her weekly work. She would start getting ready on Friday, picking the best ingredients from the French market, creating a menu that would highlight her abilities while respecting the family's Creole background. The meal normally had 7 courses. A light soup, fish made with delicate sauces, poultry seasoned with unusual spices, multiple vegetable dishes using whatever was newest from the garden, elaborate meat plates that demonstrated both her talent and the family's money, and finally, desserts that were edible works of art. The family's Sunday habit was as dependable as the sun coming up. They would meet in the living room at 5:30 for drinks before dinner, the men enjoying imported brandy while the ladies drank small glasses of sweet liqueur. Conversation would move from plantation business to New Orleans gossip, with the children required to listen quietly to their elders. Right at 6, old Moses would say that dinner was ready, and the family would walk into the dining room with the ceremony of a church service. Octave always took the seat at the head of the table with Celeste at the other end. The children and other family members sat in their set places based on a ranking that had been decided long ago and never changed. Grandmère Bogard, even at her advanced years, kept her honored spot at Octave's right side, while Auguste sat to his left. The talk during these meals was carefully managed, with every family member knowing their part in keeping up the picture of happy wealth. But underneath the surface of this carefully built home peace, tensions bubbled, ready to boil over. The spring of 1847 had brought extra worry to the Bogard home. The sugar harvest had been weak the prior year because of flooding, and lenders were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about unpaid bills. Octave had been forced to sell several pieces of land and was thinking about the unthinkable choice of selling some of his slaves to get money. These money problems had made Octave even more unpredictable than normal. His temper, never pleasant, had become explosive and impossible to foresee. The enslaved people in the household learned to spot the warnings, the way his jaw would tighten when looking at account books, the harsh tone he would use when giving orders, and most dangerously, the way his eyes would turn cold and calculating when he was thinking up some new brutality. It was during this time of growing stress that Violet's connection with Samuel started to grow into something that could no longer be concealed or overlooked. The event that led to the disaster about to happen came on a hot Thursday afternoon in late June 1847, when the Louisiana heat seemed to press down on New Orleans like a smothering blanket. Violet was in the kitchen getting ready for a dinner party the Bogards were throwing for visiting plantation owners from Charleston, carefully putting together appetizers when she heard Samuel's voice from the courtyard, raised in what seemed like trouble. She hurried to the kitchen window and witnessed a scene that would change her life forever. Samuel was down on his knees in the dusty yard, his shirt ripped and bloody, while Octave stood over him holding a leather whip. The master's face was twisted with fury, spit flying from his mouth as he shouted accusations. "You dare to look at my daughter with those eyes?" Octave's voice traveled clearly through the humid air. "You've forgotten your place, boy." Violet's blood turned freezing as she understood what had taken place. Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been going to the stables more often lately, and Violet had noticed how the girl's cheeks would get red whenever Samuel was close by. She had also seen Samuel's unease at this unwanted focus. His careful efforts to stay away from being alone with any of the white women in the house. But in the twisted thinking of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was seen as arrogance, and arrogance was an offense punishable by death. "Please, Master Bogard," Samuel gasped between hits. I would never." "Be quiet." Octave's whip cracked once more, leaving another red line across Samuel's back. "Your quiet is proof enough." But it was what happened after that decided everyone's destiny. As Octave lifted his arm for another strike, Violet couldn't hold herself back anymore. She rushed out the kitchen door and placed herself between the whip and Samuel's bleeding back. "Please, Master Octave," she yelled. "Samuel didn't do anything wrong. He's a decent man. He puts in hard work. The words stopped in her throat as Octave's face turned toward her, his look shifting from anger to something far more dangerous, cold, calculating fury. The other slaves in the courtyard seemed to pull back into the shadows, sensing that something awful was going to happen. "So," Octave said, his voice lowering to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than his earlier shouting. "The cook thinks she can tell me how to handle what belongs to me." Violet's knees started to shake, but she didn't move from where she stood protecting Samuel. "No, Master. You just what?" Octave moved closer, so near she could smell the brandy on his breath and see the pattern of broken capillaries in his eyes. "You just think you can interrupt people better than you. You think because you can make a decent meal, you have the right to question what I decide." The quiet that followed was broken only by the sound of Samuel's heavy breathing and the faraway call of a mockingbird from somewhere in the garden. Violet knew she had gone past a point she could never return from. But as she looked down at Samuel's bleeding body, she understood she didn't care. "Samuel is a decent man," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "He hasn't done anything to deserve this." Octave's laugh sounded like glass breaking. "A decent man? He's property, girl. My property. And so are you." He leaned in closer, his voice falling to a whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've gotten ideas above where you belong." What came next was a punishment that went much further than physical hurt. Octave gave orders for Samuel to be locked in the stable's tack room without any food or water, declaring he would stay there until he learned proper humility. But for Violet, he thought up something far more cruel. From now on, he announced to everyone in the household, Violet will prepare all meals like always, but she will not eat until every member of this family has stated they are pleased with her work. And since I am extremely hard to please." He let the warning remain in the air like smoke from a funeral fire. The next 3 days were a horror beyond description. Violet kept on making elaborate meals for the family while surviving on just water and the occasional bit of food that old Moses or Lily could pass to her secretly when nobody was looking. Her hands shook as she kneaded dough. Her sight became unclear as she mixed sauces, and her legs could barely hold her up as she carried heavy trays to the dining room. Yet worse than her physical pain was the mental torment Octave inflicted. He would find something wrong with every dish. The soup was too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables cooked too long. And each complaint meant another day without food. He took obvious pleasure in describing the tastes and textures of each dish while she stood in the dining room corner, forced to watch him eat the food she had made but could not taste. On the second day of her punishment, Samuel managed to get out of the tack room, pushed by desperation and worry for Violet. He got as far as the kitchen before Octave's men caught him. The beating that came after was so brutal that Dr. Tibito had to be called to make sure Samuel wouldn't die before Octave was through with him. It was while taking care of Samuel's injuries that Dr. Tibito noticed something that would later be important for understanding what happened. As he cleaned Samuel's wounds, he saw that Violet was staying close by, her face thin from hunger, but her eyes burning with a strength that made him uneasy. "That girl," he told his wife later that night, "has the expression of someone who has been pushed past where they can endure. I've seen it before in slaves who have been pushed too far. It's a dangerous expression." Dr. Tibito was a man who grasped the delicate balance that held plantation society together. Coming from a family with limited resources, he had climbed up to become one of New Orleans' most admired doctors, looking after both the wealthy plantation families and, when his conscience required it, secretly giving medical care to slaves whose owners would rather let them die than pay for treatment. He had witnessed enough cruelty through the years to comprehend its impact on the human spirit. He understood that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply collapse. They would become empty shells going through the motions of life without truly experiencing it. But some people, a dangerous few, would convert their pain into something harder and more concentrated. These were the ones who would smile while plotting revenge, who would wait patiently for the ideal moment to strike back. As he looked at Violet that day, attending to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling from exhaustion but were instead steady with resolve, Dr. Tibito recognized the signals. He made a mental note to warn Octave that his harshness was creating a risky situation. But like many such good intentions, it was something he kept meaning to do until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something within Violet died and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room watching Octave enjoy a piece of her famous praline bread pudding, describing its flavors with exaggerated pleasure while she swayed on her feet from hunger, a cold understanding settled over her mind like fog drifting in from the Mississippi. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way Octave's hand trembled slightly when he was anxious, showing that his money troubles were worse than the family admitted. The way Celeste's eyes would move to the brandy bottle when she believed nobody was watching, suggesting that the lady of the house was forming a dependence on alcohol to cope with her life. The way young Philippe would take quick looks at Lily when he thought his parents weren't watching. A look that made Violet's stomach turn with what it implied. But most significantly, she began to pay attention to the family's patterns, their likes, their routines. She noticed that Grandmere Bogard always took her medicine exactly 30 minutes before meals. She observed that August had a nervous habit of checking his pocket watch precisely every 15 minutes during dinner. She saw that little Amelie always ate her vegetables first, saving her preferred parts of the meal for last. These observations, which had once been simply part of her job as a cook, now took on a different meaning. She began to see the family not as her oppressors, but as a puzzle to be figured out, a problem that needed the proper solution. It was on that third night, as she finally fell onto her straw mattress after Octave had reluctantly said he was barely satisfied with her evening meal, that Violet made the choice that would determine all their fates. She would keep on serving the Bogard family with the same skill and commitment she had always shown, but she would serve them in a manner they would never forget. The plan that started to develop in her thoughts was not born of sudden anger or desperate impulse. It was created with the same careful focus on detail that she brought to her best meals, seasoned with the patient wisdom she had gained from years of studying the family's habits and likes. She would hold out for the ideal moment. And when that moment came, she would serve the Bogart family a meal they would remember forever. As July arrived with temperatures that appeared to melt the very air, Violet's outward actions returned to what the family considered normal. She went back to her tasks with quiet effectiveness, her face showing the proper servitude that gave no clue to the planning happening behind her dark eyes. To someone not paying close attention, it seemed that Octave's punishment had accomplished what he wanted. His rebellious cook had been broken and returned to her correct place in the household order. But those who knew Violet well began to notice slight differences. Old Moses, whose decades of survival had taught him to interpret people like weather signs, observed that Violet's motions had taken on a different quality. Where once she had worked with the fluid grace of someone who enjoyed her craft, now she moved with the mechanical exactness of clockwork. Her famous intuition in the kitchen, the ability to taste a sauce with her eyes or know exactly when bread was ready by the sound of the oven, seemed to have sharpened into something almost beyond nature. Samuel, still healing from his beating in the slave quarters, watched Violet with growing worry during their stolen moments together. The woman he had fallen in love with had possessed a warmth that could melt butter and a laugh that could chase away the darkest sorrows. The woman who now visited him in the early morning darkness seemed made from different material entirely. Her touch was still gentle when she cleaned his wounds, but her eyes held a coldness that reminded him uncomfortably of the way snakes looked at their prey just before striking. "Violet," he whispered one morning as she got ready to go back to the kitchen. "You're frightening me, girl. What's going on in your mind?" She stopped at the door, her shape outlined against the pale morning light coming through the quarter's single window. When she turned back to look at him, Samuel saw something in her face that made his blood run cold. "I'm going to handle everything," she said quietly. "You don't have to worry anymore." "What do you mean, handle everything?" But she was already gone, leaving Samuel with the awful certainty that the woman he loved was planning something that would destroy them all. The changes in Violet's actions were subtle enough that the Bogart family stayed unaware of them. If anything, they were satisfied with what they saw as the positive outcomes of Octave's discipline. Violet's meals had always been outstanding, but now they appeared to reach new levels of cooking artistry. Her presentations became more detailed, her taste combinations more refined, and her attention to detail nearly obsessive in its perfection. What the family didn't realize was that Violet had started doing a different kind of research. During her daily trips to the French market, she made stops that had nothing to do with food preparation. She began visiting the herb sellers and medicine women who operated in the shadows of New Orleans' official trade, asking questions about plants and their characteristics that might have seemed innocent to a casual observer but carried much darker meanings. New Orleans in 1847 was a city where the lines between medicine and magic, between healing and harm, were often unclear. The impact of African customs, Caribbean voodoo practices, and Native American plant knowledge had built a hidden network of healers and practitioners who grasped the double nature of many natural substances. What could cure in small amounts could kill in larger ones, and what could heal the body might also poison it, depending on the knowledge and intentions of the person doing the mixing. Violet's visits to these practitioners were careful and spread out over time. She never asked direct questions, but instead had seemingly casual conversations about herbs and their applications. She discovered which plants could cause stomach pain that might be mistaken for food poisoning, which mushrooms could bring on symptoms that resembled sudden fever, and most importantly, which mixtures of natural substances could produce effects that would puzzle even experienced doctors. Her most valuable source of knowledge came from an unlikely friendship she formed with Mama Bridget, an elderly Creole woman who sold herbs and remedies at a stall in the deepest part of the French market. Mama Bridget was whispered to be over 90 years old, though her precise age was a mystery that appeared to deepen rather than become clear with time. She had been born free in Haiti before the Great Revolution, and her knowledge of plants and their properties was famous among those who knew where to look for such wisdom. Mama Bridget never questioned why a kitchen slave was so interested in learning about the medicinal qualities of various herbs and roots. Maybe she sensed the desperation beneath Violet's careful questions. Or maybe she simply understood that knowledge was a form of power that should not be denied to those who needed it most. Whatever her reasons, she started to share information that no respectable druggist would ever discuss with a slave. "This root here," she would say, holding up a twisted piece of what looked like tree bark. "It's good for stomach troubles in small amounts, but you use too much and it causes problems the other way. Make a person very sick, very quick." Violet took in this information like a sponge, storing away every detail for later use. She learned about plants that could cause breathing trouble, herbs that could affect heart rhythm, and mushrooms that could produce nervous system symptoms that might easily be mistaken for a stroke or sudden fever. But perhaps most valuable of all, she learned about timing and dosage. Mama Bridget explained how the human body handled different substances, how long it took for various poisons to take effect, and how to figure out dosages based on body weight and physical condition. This knowledge changed Violet's understanding of her work. She began to see cooking not just as a way to feed bodies, but as a means to control them. As summer went on, Violet started doing small experiments that went completely unnoticed by the household. She would add tiny amounts of various herbs to different dishes, carefully watching the family's reactions. A pinch of one root might cause August to mention mild stomach upset. A small amount of another herb might make young Philippe feel slightly sick after dinner. These tests taught her about individual tolerances, sensitivities, and responses that would prove essential to her final plan. The family, naturally, put any minor digestive problems down to the heat and humidity of the Louisiana summer. When Celeste complained of occasional stomach discomfort, Dr. Tibido gave her a mild medicine and recommended she avoid heavy foods during the hottest time of day. When little Amelie seemed tired after a few meals, it was attributed to the normal effects of the intense heat on a child's body. Meanwhile, Violet's connection with the other slaves started to shift in ways that showed her growing isolation and single-minded focus. She had always been somewhat apart from the rest of the house staff because of her demanding position and long hours. But now she began to pull away even from those few friendships that had kept her going through the darkest times of her enslavement. Lily, who had often looked to Violet for advice and comfort during her hardest moments, found her approaches met with polite but distant responses. Old Moses, who had served as something of a father figure to Violet since her mother's death, noticed that their conversations became increasingly brief and shallow. Even Thomas, Samuel's father, started to feel uneasy around Violet, sensing something in her manner that reminded him of dangerous dogs he had known. Quiet and controlled on the surface, but coiled and ready to attack. The only person who seemed to have any understanding of Violet's true mental state was Samuel, and even he was kept at a distance as she focused more and more intensely on her preparations. During their rare moments together, he would try to draw her out, to understand what was happening behind her increasingly impenetrable mask. "You're changing, Violet," he told her one night in August as they sat in the small garden behind the slave quarters, speaking in whispers to avoid being heard. "You're becoming someone I don't know." Violet looked up at the stars, barely visible through the heavy humidity. For a moment, her mask slipped and Samuel caught a glimpse of the pain and anger she had been carrying alone for so many weeks. "They took everything from me," she said quietly. "My mama, my childhood, my freedom, and when I finally found something worth caring about, when I found you, they took that too. They beat you like an animal and made me watch. They starved me and turned it into entertainment." Samuel reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "That doesn't mean you have to become like them." "I'm not becoming like them," Violet answered, and the coldness in her voice made Samuel's skin crawl. "They destroy because they enjoy it. I'm going to destroy because it's necessary." "What are you planning, Violet? What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. A kind of peace that was somehow more frightening than any anger could have been. "I'm going to serve them exactly what they deserve," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." As summer started its slow change into fall, Violet's preparations entered their final stage. She had found the substances she would need, tested their effects in small doses, and studied the family's routines until she could foresee their actions with watch-like accuracy. Now all that was left was to pick the ideal moment and carry out her plan with the same flawless exactness she brought to preparing a 7-course meal. The opportunity she had been waiting for came in late September when Octave announced that the family would be hosting a grand Sunday dinner to celebrate the successful gathering of their sugar crop. The meal would mark not just the end of the growing season, but also Octave's victory over the money problems that had troubled him all year. Lenders had been paid, debts satisfied, and the plantation was once again on solid financial ground. It would be, Octave declared, a feast to remember. As September's heat began to ease into the more tolerable warmth of early fall, the Bogard mansion hummed with preparations for what Octave had declared would be the finest Sunday dinner New Orleans has ever seen. The successful sugar harvest had not only rescued the family from their money troubles, but had also restored Octave's confidence in his position as one of the city's most important plantation owners. The guest list for this celebration read like a directory of Louisiana's high society. Judge Honoré Dufresne and his wife would attend, along with banker Edouard Blanchard and the influential merchant Eloy Boudreau. The Reverend Father Antoine Marigny would bless the meal, while Dr. Armand Tabido would be present both as family doctor and as one of Octave's oldest friends. Even Mayor Auguste Chateau had accepted the invitation, bringing the total number of guests to 23 people who would join the 13 members of the Bogard family for an evening of celebration and excess. For Violet, this represented the high point of everything she had been working toward. A grand Sunday dinner with the extended family and New Orleans' most important citizens would provide the ideal stage for her final performance. The size of the event would require her to work with absolute precision, coordinating multiple courses while keeping the flawless timing that had made her reputation throughout the city. But what made this evening particularly ideal for Violet's purposes was a decision Octave made about the staff. Because of the importance of the event, he had ordered that all the house slaves would stay in the mansion throughout the evening, ready to attend to any need that might arise. This meant that when the moment came, everyone who had participated in or witnessed her humiliation would be present to see its resolution. As the days leading up to the dinner unfolded, Violet threw herself into preparations with an intensity that impressed even the tired members of the Bogard household. She spent hours at the French market selecting ingredients with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Each tomato was examined for perfect ripeness, each cut of meat inspected for ideal marbling, and each herb tested for best strength and freshness. Her menu for the evening was a masterpiece of Creole cooking that would showcase not only her skills but also the full range of her knowledge about food and its effects on the human body. The meal would begin with a delicate turtle soup seasoned with exactly the right balance of herbs to stimulate appetite and create a sense of anticipation for what would follow. This would be followed by pompano prepared with an elaborate sauce that required hours of careful preparation and timing. The third course would feature squab stuffed with an intricate mixture of rice, vegetables, and seasonings that had been in Violet's family for generations, though she had made certain modifications to the traditional recipe that none of her ancestors would have approved of. The meat courses would include both beef and pork prepared in different styles, accompanied by vegetables from the mansion's own garden and bread that had been rising for exactly the right amount of time to achieve perfect texture and flavor. But it was the dessert course that represented Violet's true masterpiece. She planned to serve her famous bread pudding made with pralines and a custard sauce that had been the talk of New Orleans society for years. The recipe had been her mother's secret, passed down through generations of enslaved cooks who had perfected it in plantation kitchens throughout Louisiana. Violet had spent years refining the dish until it reached a level of complexity and sophistication that made it the requested finale for every important Bogard dinner. What none of the diners would realize was that Violet had spent the past month perfecting a very different kind of recipe, one that would transform the celebration into something far more memorable than any of them could possibly imagine. Her final preparations began on Friday morning when she made her last visit to Mama Bridget's stall in the French market. The old woman greeted her with the same knowing smile she had worn during all their previous encounters. But this time there was something different in her ancient eyes, a kind of sadness that seemed to acknowledge what was about to unfold. "You sure about this path you're walking, child?" Mama Bridget asked as she wrapped the final herbs Violet would need in a piece of brown paper. "Once you start down this road, there's no turning back." Violet met her gaze without flinching. "I'm already too far down the road to turn back." They made sure of that. Mama Bridget nodded slowly and handed over the package. "Then may God have mercy on all your souls," she whispered. "Because none of you going to find it anywhere else." That weekend, as Violet began the complex process of preparing for Sunday's feast, her behavior took on an almost ritualistic quality that disturbed those who observed it closely. She moved through the kitchen with the precision of a clockmaker assembling the most delicate timepiece, each action calculated and deliberate. Her usual practice of humming while she worked had stopped entirely, replaced by a silence that seemed to fill the kitchen like fog. Samuel, still recovering from his injuries but now able to move around the plantation with limited mobility, found excuses to visit the kitchen throughout the weekend. What he saw there filled him with a dread he couldn't quite put into words. Violet worked with mechanical precision, her face expressionless as she prepared components of the meal with a kind of cold artistry that bore no resemblance to the joy she had once taken in cooking. On Saturday evening, as Violet finished the preliminary preparations for the next day's feast, Samuel finally confronted her directly. He waited until the kitchen was empty except for the two of them, then approached her as she stood cleaning her knives with obsessive thoroughness. "Violet, I'm begging you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you're planning, don't do it. We can find another way." She didn't look up from her work, but her hand stilled on the blade she was polishing. "Another way to what, Samuel?" "To get free. To get justice." She finally raised her eyes to meet his, and Samuel saw something in them that made him step backward involuntarily. "You think there's justice for people like us? You think if we just wait long enough, pray hard enough, work hard enough, someone's going to come along and set things right. I think if you do what you're planning, you're going to destroy yourself along with them." Violet set down her knife and turned to face him fully. "I've already been destroyed, Samuel. What's left is just deciding whether I'm going to die alone or take them with me. And what about me? What about us? What?" For the first time in weeks, Samuel saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with cross Violet's face, but it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "If you really love me," she said quietly, "you'll find a way to not be here tomorrow night." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "Dear God, Violet, what have you done?" But she had already turned back to her work, and Samuel knew that any chance he might have had to change her mind had passed weeks ago in a dusty courtyard under a blazing sun, when a whip had fallen across his back and something inside the woman he loved had died forever. Sunday, October 3, 1847, dawned clear and cool with the first hint of autumn in the air that made New Orleans residents grateful for the end of another brutal summer. The Bogard mansion came alive before sunrise as the household staff prepared for what everyone understood would be the social event of the season. Violet rose before dawn, as she had every day for the past 10 years. But this morning held a significance that went far beyond routine. As she dressed in the clean white apron and head wrap that were the uniform of her position, she caught sight of herself in the small piece of broken mirror that served as her only vanity. The face that looked back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, hollow-cheeked from the weight she had lost during her punishment, with eyes that held a kind of terrible calm. She spent a moment studying her reflection, memorizing the face of the woman she had been, before turning away to begin the most important day's work of her life. The kitchen became a symphony of controlled chaos as Violet orchestrated the preparation of the most elaborate meal she had ever attempted. But unlike previous grand dinners where she had worked alongside other kitchen staff, today she insisted on handling the most crucial elements entirely alone. She prepared the sauces in solitude, mixed the seasonings without assistance, and guarded her workspace with a jealousy that surprised even herself. Old Moses, whose duties as butler required him to coordinate between the kitchen and dining room, noticed that Violet seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of everyone's location in the house. She would pause in her work whenever footsteps approached, and several times he caught her listening intently to conversations in other rooms, as if she were tracking the movements of every person in the mansion. "Girl's got ears like a cat today," he muttered to Lily as they polished silver in the pantry. "Acting stranger than I've ever seen her act." Lily, whose own nerves were stretched thin by the pressure of serving such important guests, nodded absently. "She's been acting strange."